"I can solve it," said the janitor's genius daughter when she sees Billionaires in Anguish and shows him where he missed. The marker squealed, then snapped in two. Inside Finch Innovations' glass-walled boardroom, equations and angry red X's bled across the whiteboard, a battlefield of broken ideas. Alistair Finch, a man who owned Skylines, stood at the head of the table, shoulders heavy, eyes hollow. 48 hours. That's all he had left to save his wife's legacy and the billion-dollar machine sinking beneath the waves. Engineers sat frozen, defeated, their laptops glowing like funeral candles. Outside, Maria pushed her janitor's cart down the polished hall, her 10-year-old daughter Lily trailing quietly, sketchbook in hand. She paused at the door, her wide blue eyes tracing the chaotic lines on the board. Then, in a voice so small it barely carried through the glass, she said, "I can solve it." Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. The little girl's crayon drawing held the key to a billion-dollar failure. Alistair Finch, a man who owned Skylines, could not command the sea. His final promise to his wife was sinking just off the coast, and with it, the last piece of his heart. The evening light had softened to a gentle orange, but inside the headquarters of Finch Innovations, the lights were harsh and unforgiving. They reflected off the polished marble floors that Maria cleaned every night. Her cart squeaked softly, a familiar, lonely sound in the vast, empty corridors. It was a sound of quiet diligence, a sound that went unheard by the important people who walked these halls during the day. Tonight, however, she was not entirely alone. Sitting on a small bench near the elevators was her daughter, Lily, a 10-year-old girl with hair the color of pale corn silk, tied back in a simple ponytail. In her lap was a sketchbook, and in her hand, a blue crayon. She wasn't drawing anything in particular, just letting the crayon glide across the paper, making soft, swirling patterns that looked like waves, or wind, or both. Lily had to come with her mother to work this week. The woman who usually watched her was visiting family, and Maria couldn't afford to miss a single shift. So Lily became her mother's silent partner, a small, well-behaved shadow in a world of glass and steel. She knew the rules: stay quiet, don't touch anything, and always be where her mother could see her. Maria paused her mopping, her back aching from the long hours. She looked over at her daughter, and a soft smile touched her lips. Lily was a good girl. She never complained. She had a calm stillness about her that was rare in a child. She saw the world in a different way, noticing little details others missed. The way a spiderweb caught the light, the precise pattern of tiles on the floor, the rhythm of the rain against the tall windows. Her teachers said she was gifted, but to Maria, she was just her Lily, her quiet, thoughtful girl. "Almost done, mija," Maria whispered, her voice a gentle echo in the hall. "Just one more floor." Lily looked up from her sketchbook and gave a small nod, her bright blue eyes full of understanding. She knew this was hard for her mother. She saw the weariness in her shoulders and the faint lines of worry around her eyes. She wanted to help, but all she could do was be good, be quiet, and not add to her mother's burdens. The top floor was different. It was where the most important offices were. The air here felt heavier, charged with a tension that lingered long after the employees had gone home. Maria pushed her cart out of the elevator and immediately felt it. A low hum of anxiety. The lights were still on in the main boardroom, a massive space enclosed by floor-to-ceiling glass walls. Inside, a group of men and women in expensive suits were gathered around a long, dark table. They looked exhausted, defeated. Papers were scattered everywhere. Coffee cups sat half empty. At the head of the table stood the man who owned the entire building, the entire company. Mr. Alistair Finch. Even from a distance, his presence was immense. He was a tall man, with graying hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. But tonight, that stone was cracking. He stared at a giant whiteboard on the wall, a board covered in complex equations, diagrams, and angry red lines crossing out failed ideas. His shoulders were slumped. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. Maria had seen him many times, but never like this. He always seemed so powerful, so untouchable. Now, he just looked like a man in pain. Lily stood up from her bench and walked quietly to her mother's side. her small hand finding Maria's. She peered through the glass wall, her gaze not on the tired faces of the engineers, but on the whiteboard. Her head tilted, her brow furrowed in concentration. It was like a puzzle to her, a very messy, very complicated puzzle. Inside the boardroom, the mood was bleak. "It's no use, Alistair," said a man with a tired voice. His name was Sterling, the lead engineer. "We've run every simulation. We've rebuilt the core 3 times. The resonance frequency is just too unstable. The moment a rogue wave hits, the gyroscopic stabilizers overload and the whole array shuts down. It's a fundamental design flaw." Alistair Finch didn't turn. He kept his eyes fixed on the board, on one particular diagram. It was a sketch of the Nereid array, his life's work. A revolutionary system of underwater turbines designed to harness the immense power of ocean currents, turning them into clean, limitless energy. It was more than a project. It was a monument. "There is no flaw in the design," Alistair said, his voice low and raspy. "The theory is sound. Elena, my wife, she proved the theory." The room fell silent at the mention of his wife. Elena Finch had been a brilliant oceanographer, a woman who saw the sea not as a force to be conquered, but as a partner to be understood. The Nereid array was her dream, her legacy. After she had passed away from a sudden illness 2 years ago, Alistair had poured his entire fortune and his entire soul into making it a reality. It was the last promise he had made to her. And now, it was failing. "With all due respect, sir," Sterling said, his tone careful but firm. "Elena's theories were beautiful, but they were theoretical. The practical application, the harsh reality of the ocean, it's just not cooperating. Maybe it's time we consider shelving the project. Cut our losses." Alistair finally turned, and the look in his eyes made Sterling take an involuntary step back. It was a look of pure, cold anguish. "Losses?" Alistair repeated, the word like poison on his tongue. "You talk to me about losses? I will not lose this. I will not lose her again. We are missing something. Something simple. Something right in front of our faces." He ran a hand through his hair, his composure crumbling. He walked to the window and stared out at the dark ocean, a vast, indifferent expanse that held his wife's memory and, now, his failure. 48 hours, he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The International Review Board arrives in 48 hours. If we don't have a solution by then, they will pull the funding and the oceanic permits. It will all be over." Outside in the hall, Maria began to gently pull her daughter away. This felt too private, too raw. It was not their place to witness such a powerful man's despair. "Come, Lily. Let's go." But Lily didn't move. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the chaotic scribbles on the whiteboard. She saw the lines, the arrows, the numbers. But she also saw something else. She saw a pattern, a mistake. It was a mistake she had seen before, in her own drawings. When you try to force a circle into a square, the corners always break. They were trying to force the water. You couldn't force water. You had to ask it. She pulled her hand free from her mother's and took 2 small steps toward the glass door of the boardroom. Her heart was beating fast, a tiny drum in her chest. "Lily, no," Maria whispered urgently, trying to pull her back. "We cannot disturb them." But the words were already leaving Lily's lips, quiet and clear, spoken with the simple confidence of a child who does not yet know that some things are supposed to be impossible. "I can solve it." The words were so soft, they were almost lost in the cavernous hall. But through the glass, one of the younger engineers heard them. He glanced over, saw the janitor and her little girl, and let out a short, tired laugh. "Looks like we've got some help," he muttered to the person next to him. Sterling heard him and turned, his face a mask of irritation. He saw Maria, frozen in place, her eyes wide with fear and apology. And he saw the small, blonde-haired girl standing at the door, looking straight at the whiteboard. "What was that?" Sterling demanded, his voice sharp. Maria rushed forward and put her hands on Lily's shoulders. "I am so sorry, sir," she said, her voice trembling. She didn't mean anything. "We are leaving now. I am so sorry to disturb you." She tried to steer Lily away, but the girl stood her ground, her small feet planted on the marble floor. She looked past the angry man and directly at the grieving man by the window. Alistair Finch had turned. He wasn't looking at her with anger, but with a deep, hollow curiosity. The voice had been a child's. What could a child possibly have to say in a moment like this? What did you say, little girl? Alistair asked, his voice softer than Sterling's, but carrying much more weight. Lily took a steadying breath. She pointed a small finger toward the whiteboard. The drawing, she said. It's fighting the water. That's why it breaks. A ripple of disbelief and quiet mockery went through the room. A few engineers exchanged exhausted, incredulous looks. Sterling's face hardened. This is ridiculous, he snapped. We are in the middle of a multi-billion-dollar crisis, and we're being interrupted by a janitor's child talking about drawings. Security should have them removed. No, Alistair said, his voice cutting through the tension. He walked slowly from the window until he stood just on the other side of the glass door, looking down at the small girl. He saw no mischief in her eyes, only a strange, focused sincerity. He saw the sketchbook clutched in her other hand. He saw the blue crayon stains on her fingertips. For 2 years, he had listened to the most brilliant, most expensive minds in engineering. They had given him data, algorithms, and complex fluid dynamics. And every single one of them had failed. His heart was already broken. His project was on the brink of collapse. What more was there to lose by listening to a whisper of hope, no matter where it came from? He looked at Maria, who looked like she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. It's all right, he said gently. Then he looked back at Lily. What do you mean? It's fighting the water. Lily took another step closer, until her face was just inches from the glass. You're using sharp angles against the current, she explained, her voice gaining a little more strength. The water doesn't like to be cut. It likes to spiral, like a seashell, or the water going down the drain in the sink. It wants to dance. Dance. The word hung in the air, so simple and out of place among the cold, hard terms of engineering. An engineer in the back of the room snorted, trying to stifle a laugh. Sterling rolled his eyes in open contempt. This is a waste of our time, Alistair, Sterling insisted. She's talking about seashells and dancing. We have work to do. But Alistair wasn't listening to Sterling. He was listening to an echo from the past. He remembered a day on the beach with Elena, years ago. She was holding a nautilus shell, tracing its perfect, logarithmic spiral with her finger. The universe always chooses the easiest path, Ollie, she had told him, her eyes sparkling. The path of least resistance. It's not about force. It's about flow. It's a dance. His breath caught in his throat. He looked at the whiteboard, at the rigid, aggressive angles of their turbine blades, designed for maximum force, maximum resistance. He looked back at the little girl with the crayon-stained fingers. He made a decision. It was not a decision based on logic or reason. It was an act of pure, desperate faith. An act of a drowning man reaching for a hand, no matter how small. He slid open the heavy glass door. The hushed air of the boardroom spilled out into the hall. He knelt, bringing himself down to Lily's eye level. The powerful billionaire, kneeling before the janitor's daughter. The room watched in stunned silence. Show me, Alistair Finch said, his voice thick with an emotion no one could quite name. Show me how the water wants to dance. The room held its breath. Sterling's jaw was tight with fury, his authority utterly undermined. Maria stood frozen, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm of fear and a tiny, unbelievable spark of pride. Her daughter, her quiet little Lily, was not backing down. Lily looked at the grieving billionaire, a man whose pain she had seen through the glass. She felt a strange connection to him, an understanding that went beyond words. She gave him a small, solemn nod. She was not afraid of the angry men in the room. She was only afraid of the sadness in his eyes. She walked past him, her small sneakers silent on the floor. She walked straight to the giant whiteboard that had defeated a room full of geniuses. She reached up, but her hand could only reach the very bottom edge. It was a board built for tall men and their tall ideas. Without a word, Alistair stood up and walked to a corner of the room, returning with a heavy leather chair. He placed it in front of the board. Here, he said softly. Lily climbed onto the chair. Now, she could see the whole mess properly. She looked at all the complicated equations and crossed out diagrams. She ignored them all. She looked for a clean space. One of the younger engineers, a woman named Clara who had been silent until now, stepped forward. She held out a black, dry erase marker. Do you need this? She asked, her voice gentle. Lily shook her head. No, thank you, she said politely. She reached into the pocket of her simple dress and pulled out her own tool, a stubby, well-worn blue crayon. Sterling let out a sound of pure disgust. A crayon? Oh, for heaven's sake. Alistair, this has gone far enough. Alistair silenced him with a single, sharp look. Let her work. Lily turned her back to the room. She faced the whiteboard, the blue crayon held tight in her small hand. She took a deep breath, the way her mother had taught her to do when she felt nervous. She wasn't thinking about the billion-dollar project or the room full of important people. She was thinking about the ocean. She was thinking about the beach and the way the waves pulled back from the sand, leaving delicate, curved patterns. She was thinking about the spiral galaxy in her science book. Then, she began to draw. She did not draw a machine. She did not draw a turbine. She drew a spiral. It started from a single point, then unfolded outwards, graceful and perfect. It looked less like an engineering blueprint and more like a work of art. It looked like a fossil, a flower, a hurricane scene from space. Next to it, she drew a series of smaller spirals, all turning in harmony with the first. She didn't use a ruler. She didn't measure angles. She just drew what felt right, what looked natural. She drew the path of least resistance. When she was done, she turned not to the engineers, but to Alistair. There, she said simply. You see? The blades shouldn't be sharp. They should be curved. Not like knives, but like arms. They shouldn't cut the water. They should embrace it. The water comes in, and you welcome it, and you let it spin. And when it leaves, it's happy. It's not tired from fighting. The room was utterly silent. The engineers stared at the childish blue crayon, drawing on their board of failures. It was so simple, so primitive. It broke dozens of established rules of hydrodynamic engineering. It seemed, on the surface, absurd. Sterling was the first to speak, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Embrace the water? Happy water? Are we building a power plant or a nursery school? This is the most unscientific nonsense I have ever heard. He walked to the board and pointed a dismissive finger at the crayon spiral. This shape would create a massive drag coefficient. The torque would be completely unpredictable. It would tear itself apart in a high-velocity current. Another engineer chimed in. He's right, sir. The structural integrity of a blade shaped like that, it's just not feasible. It goes against everything we know. But Alistair wasn't looking at the other engineers. He was staring at the drawing, and his mind was racing. He was stripping away his own complex knowledge, his years of training, and trying to see it as Lily did. Not as an engineer, but as an observer of nature. Elena's words echoed again. Nature has already solved all the problems, Ollie. We just have to be humble enough to copy it. The spiral. It was everywhere in the ocean. In shells, in whirlpools, in the very shape of the water molecules dance. They had been trying to impose their own rigid geometry on a world that only understood the language of curves. They had built a machine of straight lines to put in a world of spirals. Clara, Alistair said, his voice quiet but firm, his eyes never leaving the drawing. Run a simulation. Clara looked stunned. A simulation? Of that? She asked, gesturing toward the crayon drawing. Yes, Alistair said. Model it. Exactly as she drew it. A Fibonacci spiral. Redesign the turbine blades based on that curve. Forget drag coefficients. Forget what the textbooks say. Just build a simulation of what this little girl has drawn on our board. Sterling threw his hands up in the air in exasperation. This is madness. It will take hours to code a new model from scratch. Hours we don't have. And for what? To test a child's doodle. Yes. Alistair repeated, his voice now like steel. For that. If you are not willing to do it, Sterling, then you are welcome to leave. Clara, get your team. I want to see what this does. I want to see what happens when we stop fighting. A profound shift happened in the room. The mockery faded, replaced by a tense, uncertain curiosity. Clara, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement, nodded quickly. Yes, sir. Right away. She and two other younger engineers hurried to their laptops, their fingers flying across the keyboards as they began to translate Lily's simple crayon drawing into the complex language of code. The other senior engineers stood around, watching with folded arms, their faces a mixture of skepticism and grudging respect for Alistair's command. They thought he was a fool, but he was the fool who signed their paychecks. Sterling stood off to the side, his face dark with rage and humiliation. He had been overruled. He had been ignored. And he had been replaced, in this moment, by a 10-year-old girl with a blue crayon. Maria watched from the doorway, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She didn't understand the equations or the simulations, but she understood the look on Mr. Finch's face. It was not the look of a man who had given up. It was the look of a man who had just found something he thought was lost forever. Hope. Lily remained on the chair, her small legs dangling. She watched the engineers work, listening to the quiet clicking of their keyboards. She felt Alistair's presence beside her. He had not moved. He stood there like a sentinel, guarding her drawing, guarding his last chance. "Why did you choose blue?" he asked her quietly, his voice a low rumble. Lily looked at her crayon, then back at the board. "It's the color of the ocean," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You have to use its favorite color, so it knows you're a friend." Alistair looked from the drawing to the little girl, and for the first time in 2 years, a genuine, unburdened smile reached his eyes. He had spent hundreds of millions of dollars on supercomputers, material science, and the finest minds money could buy. And all this time, the answer might have been as simple as a spiral, drawn in the ocean's favorite color. The hours ticked by. The orange glow of sunset had long faded, replaced by the deep black of night, dotted with the distant lights of ships on the water. No one left the boardroom. A tray of untouched sandwiches sat on a side table. The only sounds were the clicking of keys and the low hum of the building's ventilation system. Maria had brought Lily a small bottle of water and a blanket from the emergency kit in her janitor's closet. Lily had fallen asleep in the big chair, her head resting on her arm, her blue crayon still held loosely in her fingers. She looked so small, so peaceful, in this room full of giants and their giant problems. Finally, after nearly 3 hours, Clara looked up from her screen. Her face was pale. "It's ready," she announced, her voice trembling slightly. "The simulation is ready." The room stirred. Everyone gathered behind her, their eyes fixed on the large projection screen that covered one wall. Alistair gently shook Lily's shoulder. "Wake up, little one," he whispered. "I think you'll want to see this." Lily's eyes fluttered open. She looked at the big screen, which now showed a digital representation of the ocean floor, and the newly designed Nereid array floating in the virtual current. The turbines looked different. They were graceful, curved, almost alive. They looked like her drawing. "We'll run the doomsday scenario," Clara said, her voice tense. "System shock from a level 5 rogue wave. It's the one that caused the cascade failure in every previous test." Sterling stepped forward, a grim, knowing smirk on his face. "Get ready to watch your pretty little seashell tear itself to pieces, Finch." Alistair ignored him. He placed a steadying hand on Lily's shoulder. "Proceed, Clara." Clara took a deep breath and pressed the enter key. The simulation began. On the screen, the digital water flowed smoothly. The new turbines spun in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, perfectly in sync with the current. They looked like a school of strange, mechanical jellyfish. The numbers on the side of the screen, representing power output and structural stress, were all stable. All green. "Here it comes," someone whispered. A massive wave, a dark wall of code, began to form on the edge of the screen. It moved with terrifying speed toward the array. In every other simulation, this was the moment of failure. This was the moment the alarms would blare red and the system would collapse. The engineers leaned in. Even Sterling held his breath. The rogue wave hit the array. But instead of shattering, something incredible happened. The array did not fight it. It yielded. The spiraled blades absorbed the initial impact, their curves channeling the massive surge of energy not against the structure, but through it. The central turbine, the one designed from Lily's main drawing, began to spin faster and faster, its spiral arms guiding the chaotic torrent into a controlled, powerful vortex. The numbers on the screen flashed. Structural stress went from green to yellow, but it held. It did not go to red. Power output, however, shot off the charts, a massive, clean spike of energy that far exceeded any of their previous projections. The wave passed. The array slowed, its spin returning to its normal, graceful rhythm. It was completely unharmed. The numbers on the screen all returned to green. Stable. Secure. Successful. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a silence so deep, so profound, it was louder than any shout. The engineers stared, their mouths hanging open. They were looking at the impossible. Sterling's face had gone ashen. The smirk was gone, replaced by a look of utter, soul-crushing disbelief. He looked from the screen to the little girl, then back again. It made no sense. It defied his logic. It defied his education. It defied him. Clara was the first to find her voice, and it was nothing more than a choked whisper. It worked. The whisper broke the spell. The room erupted, not with cheers, but with gasps of astonishment. People turned to each other, their faces alight with wonder. One of the older engineers took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, as if to make sure he wasn't dreaming. Alistair Finch felt the hand on Lily's shoulder tremble. He looked down at the child, who was watching the screen with a simple, satisfied smile. Of course it worked. It was friendly with the water. He then looked across the room at his team of defeated geniuses, now reborn in a moment of shared wonder. And he felt a flood of emotion so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. It was not just relief. It was a profound, humbling realization. He had been looking for a solution in equations and processors, when all along, the answer was in the heart of a child, and in the memory of the woman who had taught him to listen to the sea. He knelt down again in front of Lily, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He did not know what to say. How do you thank someone who has just given you back a dream? How do you thank someone who has just honored the memory of your wife in a way you never could? So he said the only words that felt true. Thank you, Lily. You didn't just solve the problem. You reminded me of the answer. He then stood and faced the room. His voice was quiet, but it rang with an authority no one dared question. Sterling, he said, his gaze hard as diamond. You're fired. I want you out of this building tonight. I have no room for a man whose pride is greater than his curiosity. Then he turned to the rest of the team. As for the rest of you, our work is just beginning. We are rebuilding the Nereid array, and our new lead design consultant, he said, placing his hand gently on Lily's blonde hair, is right here. He looked at Maria, who was now openly weeping with shock and joy. And madam, he said with a voice full of respect, I believe we have a new position for you at this company. One that doesn't involve a mop and bucket. We're going to need a parent on site. The aftermath of that night was swift and decisive. Sterling was escorted from the building by security, his face a thunderous mask of fury. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The venom in his eyes spoke of a humiliation so profound it would curdle into a long, bitter poison. As the glass doors slid shut behind him, a chapter of cold, rigid certainty at Finch Innovations came to an end, and a new one, based on a child's crayon drawing, began. For Maria and Lily, life changed in the blink of an eye. The next morning, a car, sleek and black and impossibly quiet, arrived at their small apartment building. The driver, a kind man in a neat suit, informed Maria that Mr. Finch had arranged for them to be moved. Moved where? She didn't know. She packed their few belongings in a state of dazed disbelief, her hands trembling as she folded Lily's clothes into a cardboard box. Their new home was a beautiful little house in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, with a small garden in the back and a bedroom for Lily painted the color of a summer sky. There was food in the refrigerator. There were new clothes in the closets. There were art supplies and more books than Lily had ever seen in one place, stacked neatly on a new wooden desk. It was more than Maria had ever dared to dream of for her daughter, for herself. It felt like a fairy tale, and she kept waiting for the clock to strike midnight. Alistair had been true to his word. Maria was given a new title, Special Projects Liaison. It was a formal name for a simple but vital role. She was to be Lily's guardian and companion within the company, ensuring the child was never overwhelmed, that her education continued, and that her voice was always heard. She was given an office next to Clara's, a comfortable salary, and most importantly, the quiet dignity of being seen not as a servant, but as a valued member of a team. The respect in the eyes of the other engineers was the greatest gift of all. Lily, in her own quiet way, blossomed. The Nereid Array project was rebuilt from the ground up, this time centered on what the engineers now called the Lily Spiral, or the seashell principle. She would spend a few hours each day in the design lab. She didn't sit in on the complex technical meetings, but in a special workshop Alistair had built for her, filled with modeling clay, water tanks, and 3D printers. Here, she would build and test her ideas, not with numbers, but with her hands. She would show the engineers how the water wanted to move, and they, humbled and endlessly fascinated, would translate her tangible wisdom into their digital world. The atmosphere in the company had transformed. The grim tension was replaced with a buzz of excitement and creative energy. The team, free from Sterling's rigid and prideful leadership, began to collaborate in ways they never had before. They laughed. They experimented. They weren't afraid to fail, because they knew that Lily's principle wasn't about getting the math right on the first try. It was about listening to the answer that was already there. The bond between Alistair, Lily, and Maria deepened into something that resembled a family. He was no longer just a boss. He was a protector, a benefactor, a friend. He would often join Lily in her workshop, not to supervise, but to watch and learn. He saw so much of his Elena in the girl's intuitive genius, in her gentle, respectful approach to the powerful forces of nature. One afternoon, he brought an old, leather-bound photo album to Maria's office. He opened it carefully, and on the first page was a picture of a smiling, sun-kissed woman with bright, intelligent eyes, holding a nautilus shell on a beach. This was Elena, he said, his voice soft with memory. She would have adored Lily. She always said that the greatest discoveries are made by those who have not yet learned what is supposedly impossible. He told them stories about her, about their travels, about her passion for the ocean. He explained that the Nereid Array wasn't about money or fame. It was about Elena's belief that humanity had to stop fighting the planet and learn to live in harmony with it. She believed the ocean held the key not just to clean energy, but to a better way of thinking, he explained. She called it nature's gentle strength. Listening to him, Maria finally understood the depth of his past grief and the source of his present joy. Lily hadn't just saved a project. She had resurrected a man's soul. She had given him a way to finish his final conversation with the woman he loved. As the months passed, the project leaped forward. The small-scale prototypes were a stunning success. The energy output was even greater than the first simulation had predicted. News of the revolutionary new design began to leak to the outside world. Industry magazines wrote speculative articles about the Finch spiral, a technology that could change the face of renewable energy. And at the heart of every article was the whispered, unbelievable rumor of the janitor's 10-year-old daughter who had seen what no one else could. For Lily, the attention was strange, but Alistair shielded her from the press, insisting that she be allowed to remain a child. Her greatest joy was still a blank page in her sketchbook, a fresh block of clay, or a walk in the garden with her mother. But now, when she drew her spirals, she knew they were more than just patterns. They were helping to heal her mother's weariness and a good man's broken heart. But while a new family was being forged in the light of discovery and kindness, a dark obsession was festering in the shadows. Miles away, in a cramped and soulless apartment, Everett Sterling was living a nightmare of his own making. He was a pariah. The story of his dismissal, and the bizarre reason behind it, had spread through the insular world of high-level engineering like wildfire. He was the man who had been replaced by a 10-year-old with a crayon. He was a joke. Every attempt to find a new position at a respectable firm was met with thinly veiled amusement or outright rejection. His name was now associated with failure, with arrogance, and with a spectacular lack of vision. He would spend his days aimlessly scrolling through news feeds, each article praising the progress of the Nereid Array, a fresh twist of the knife in his gut. He saw pictures of Alistair Finch, smiling again, standing beside the little blonde girl. He read quotes from Clara, his former subordinate, now the head of the project, talking about the paradigm shift of the seashell principle. It was his project, his team, his legacy, stolen from him. His professional pride, the very core of his identity, had been shattered. And in its place, a cold, methodical rage began to grow. He didn't see a story of hope or wonder. He saw a pathetic old man, blinded by grief, indulging a child's fantasy. He saw a fluke, a lucky guess that would eventually be exposed. He refused to believe Lily's simple design was truly sound. It had to have a flaw, a fatal, hidden flaw. And he, Everett Sterling, would be the one to find it. He began to work, his brilliant mind now twisted toward a singular, destructive purpose. He spent his severance pay not on finding a new life, but on recreating the Finch Innovations design lab in his own small apartment. He acquired pirated copies of their modeling software. He hacked into the public records of their suppliers, studying their materials lists. He became a ghost, haunting the edges of the project he was banished from. He ran hundreds of his own simulations, pushing Lily's spiral design to its absolute limits. He was looking for a breaking point, a weakness he could exploit. For weeks, he found nothing. The design was maddeningly resilient. The gentle curves distributed stress in a way that his own rigid, angular designs never could. Every successful simulation was another insult, fueling his fury. Finally, he found it. It wasn't a flaw in the design itself, but a potential vulnerability in its application. A matter of physics he was sure the new, starry-eyed team would overlook. It involved harmonic resonance, but not from water, from sound. The turbines, when operating at peak capacity under the specific pressure of a deep-sea current, would generate a unique, low-frequency hum. Normally, this would be harmless. But Stirling calculated that if a specific metallic alloy, one he knew their primary supplier used for pressure bolts, was subjected to that exact frequency for a prolonged period, it would suffer from acoustic fatigue. The metal's crystalline structure would slowly become brittle. It wouldn't show up on any standard stress test. It would be invisible, until it wasn't. Under the combined strain of a powerful ocean swell and the acoustic vibrations, the bolts holding the main turbine blades to the central axle would shear. Not just one, but all of them, in a catastrophic, simultaneous failure. The entire array would tear itself apart from the inside out. It would look like the natural design simply wasn't strong enough to handle the reality of the ocean. It would be a spectacular, public failure. His plan was born. It was elegant. It was subtle. It was undetectable. It would not only destroy the project and Alistair Finch's reputation, but it would also validate Stirling's own genius. He would prove that he had been right all along, that you couldn't trust the fate of a billion-dollar project to a child's fanciful dream. Now, he just had to put the pieces in place. He started making calls. He still had contacts in the industry, people who owed him favors, people who were disgruntled, people for whom a briefcase full of cash was more persuasive than loyalty. He found a foreman at the fabrication plant where the pressure bolts were being forged, a man with gambling debts and a weak will. In a dimly lit bar far from the gleaming towers of the financial district, Stirling made his pitch. He didn't talk about sabotage. He talked about quality control. I have reason to believe the standard grade 8 titanium alloy bolts Finch ordered are insufficient for the deep sea pressure they'll be under, Stirling said smoothly, sliding a thick envelope across the sticky table. I have a proprietary alloy that is far superior. I want you to switch the stock. Use my bolts for the Nereid project. Consider it a professional consultation, a way to prevent a disaster. The foreman looked at the envelope, then at Stirling's cold, intense eyes. He knew something wasn't right, but the money was a powerful argument against his conscience. He took the envelope. No one will ever know, the foreman promised. Stirling gave a thin, cruel smile. Oh, I'm counting on it. The trap was set. The flawed, brittle bolts were forged and shipped. They were installed deep within the heart of the magnificent new turbines. They passed every inspection because no one was looking for a weakness that came from a sound. And Everett Stirling sat in his dark apartment, watching the news, and waited for the day of the launch. The day of his vindication. The day the world would watch the seashell dream shatter into a million pieces. The day of the launch arrived bright and clear. A perfect blue sky stretched over the calm ocean, as if nature itself was offering its blessing. A massive viewing platform had been constructed on the coast, overlooking the spot several miles out where the full-scale Nereid array was in its final position, a sleeping giant beneath the waves. The atmosphere was electric. This was more than a product launch. It was a celebration of hope. Boats dotted the water, filled with reporters and photographers from around the world. The platform was crowded with investors, scientists, and government officials, all eager to witness the dawn of a new era in clean energy. Alistair Finch stood at the podium, looking 10 years younger. Maria stood beside him, her hand resting on Lily's shoulder. Lily was wearing a simple white dress, looking a little overwhelmed by the crowd, but her eyes were fixed on the patch of ocean where she knew her creation was waiting. The engineering team, led by a proud and beaming Clara, stood behind them. Today is not about me, Alistair began, his voice carrying over the speakers, filled with a powerful, quiet emotion. It is not about my company. It is about an idea that belonged to my late wife, Elena, the idea that we can work with our planet, not against it. that the greatest power is not found in force, but in harmony. He paused, and his eyes found Lily. That idea was given a voice, a shape, by someone who sees the world with more clarity and wisdom than any of us. A young girl who reminded us that sometimes the most brilliant solutions are found not in complex equations, but in the simple, perfect spiral of a seashell. The crowd applauded warmly. Lily blushed, and Maria squeezed her shoulder gently. In a few moments, Alistair concluded, we will activate the Nereid array. We will begin the dance, and we will offer the world a new promise. A promise of clean, limitless energy, born from a partnership with the very ocean that gives us all life. He stepped back from the podium and walked to a large, ceremonial control panel. Lily, he said, his voice soft enough for only her to hear. Would you do the honors? He guided her small hand to a large, glowing blue button. Her eyes lit up. She looked at her mother, who nodded with a tearful smile. She looked at Alistair, who gave her a reassuring wink. With a deep breath, Lily pressed the button. A low, powerful hum vibrated up from the seafloor, a sound felt more than heard. On the giant screens behind the stage, a live video feed from underwater drones came to life. The Nereid array was waking up. The magnificent, spiraling turbines began to turn, slowly at first, then faster, moving with a hypnotic grace that silenced the crowd. The data streams poured in, displayed in bright green numbers on the screen. Power output climbed steadily, beautifully. 100 megawatts, 500 megawatts, 1,000 megawatts. It was exceeding all expectations. The project was a triumph. The crowd burst into applause. Alistair threw his arms around Maria and Lily in a joyful embrace. Miles away, in his dark apartment, Everett Sterling watched the live feed, his face impassive. He listened to the commentators gush, watched the power numbers climb. He felt nothing. He was simply waiting. Now for the final test, Clara announced from the control center. We will simulate a deep-sea stress event by activating the acoustic resonators. This will put the array under the maximum strain we expect it to ever endure. On the screen, the virtual water around the turbines began to churn more violently. The turbines spun faster. The low hum from the ocean deepened, changing in pitch, settling into the precise, destructive frequency Sterling had calculated. He leaned closer to his monitor. His heart began to beat a little faster. Come on, he whispered to the screen. Dance for me. At first, everything seemed fine. The numbers held steady. The turbines spun flawlessly, a testament to their incredible design. The celebration on the platform continued. But then, Lily, who was watching the video feed with intense focus, frowned. Something was wrong. It wasn't in the numbers. It was in the movement. The dance was changing. It looks angry, she whispered to Alistair. He looked at her, then back at the screen, trying to see what she saw. And then a flicker of yellow appeared on the data stream. A single sensor, reading an anomalous vibration on the main axle. Clara saw it too. Minor resonance flutter on the primary turbine, she said, her voice calm, but with a new edge of concern. It should self-correct. But it didn't. Another yellow light blinked on. And another. The graceful hum from the ocean was now accompanied by a high-pitched whine. The video feed shook slightly. On the screen, the main turbine, the heart of the array, was starting to wobble, its perfect spin becoming erratic. The mood on the platform shifted from celebration to confusion, then to alarm. The green numbers began to flash red. Structural integrity warnings. Cascade failure imminent. Shut it down. Alistair yelled. Shut it all down now. But it was too late. In the dark heart of the machine, deep beneath the waves, the acoustic fatigue had reached its breaking point. The pressure bolts, their metallic structure shattered by the invisible vibrations, sheared in a single, catastrophic instant. On the screen, the world watched in horror as the giant, spiraling blades of the main turbine detached from the axle. Freed from their housing, they were flung outwards by the immense centrifugal force, tearing through the rest of the array like shrapnel. Metal screamed and twisted. The elegant dance became a maelstrom of destruction. The video feed dissolved into a chaotic blur of sand, debris, and then darkness. Silence. A dead screen. On the platform, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Alistair Finch stood frozen, his face ashen, staring at the blank screen as if he could will the image back to life. The dream, the promise, the tribute to his wife, his redemption, all of it, gone. Destroyed in less than 30 seconds. Maria held Lily tightly, shielding her from the horrified faces and the sudden, frantic shouting of the reporters. Lily was trembling, not from fear, but from a profound, heartbreaking confusion. Her creation, her beautiful, friendly machine, had torn itself apart. Alistair slowly sank to his knees, the strength gone from his legs. He was no longer a billionaire, no longer an innovator. He was just a man, watching the last piece of his wife's soul sink into the abyss. And in his apartment, Everett Sterling leaned back in his chair and allowed himself a long, slow, deeply satisfied smile. His revenge was absolute. The world had seen the truth. A child's dream was no match for the cold, hard realities of physics. And he was the only one who had been smart enough to see it. The screen in front of him replayed the final moments of destruction, a symphony of failure that was music to his ears. The silence that followed the disaster was a heavy, suffocating blanket. On the platform, the festive atmosphere had curdled into a scene of chaos and disbelief. Reporters shouted questions into cameras, their voices sharp with accusation. Investors spoke in furious, hushed tones into their phones, the words ruin and lawsuit cutting through the air. The dream had died, publicly and spectacularly. In the days that followed, the world's judgment was swift and merciless. Newspapers and websites ran brutal headlines. Finch's folly sinks. Billion-dollar dream becomes deep-sea nightmare. The danger of naive designs. Everett Sterling, quoted as an anonymous, former senior engineer, gave scathing interviews, speaking sorrowfully about how Alistair Finch's grief had clouded his judgment, leading him to trust in unscientific, sentimental fantasy over proven engineering. He was the voice of reason, the prophet whose warnings had been ignored. His narrative became the truth. Alistair Finch vanished from public view. The company he had built was collapsing under a mountain of debt and broken contracts. He was forced to begin selling off assets, his vast empire crumbling piece by piece. The Nereid array, the source of his hope, was now the anchor that was dragging him into the abyss. Maria and Lily were insulated from the worst of it, living quietly in the little house that now felt like a gilded cage. The world outside was angry, and Lily was at the center of that anger. Maria kept the television off and the newspapers out of sight, but she couldn't protect her daughter from the feeling of failure that had settled over them like a cold fog. Lily had changed. The bright spark in her eyes had dimmed. She no longer spent her afternoons in the garden or with her modeling clay. Her sketchbook lay on her desk, unopened. She believed, with the absolute and heartbreaking certainty of a child, that it was her fault. Her drawing, her idea, had caused all this pain. She had hurt Mr. Finch. She had broken his promise to his wife. One evening, Maria found her daughter trying to erase the crayon drawings from the wall of her workshop with a wet cloth, silent tears streaming down her face. Maria's heart broke. A week after the disaster, the quiet black car appeared on their street again. Alistair Finch got out. He looked a decade older. His shoulders were stooped. His face was etched with new lines of grief. But his eyes, when he looked at Maria, were clear. He found Lily in her room, sitting on her bed, staring at the blank wall. He sat down gently beside her. He didn't say anything for a long time. "They are saying it was my fault," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. "They said my spiral was weak." Alistair took her small hand in his. It felt impossibly fragile. At that moment, something shifted inside him. The weight of his own despair was immense, but the weight of this child's undeserved guilt was unbearable. He had lost his company, his fortune, his reputation. He would not allow this little girl to lose her light. "They are wrong, Lily," he said, his voice quiet but fierce. "Your spiral wasn't weak. It was beautiful. It was right. I know it was." He looked from the child to her mother, a new resolve hardening in his eyes. "My wife, Elena, she never gave up on an idea she believed in. And your idea, Lily, was the same as hers. I will not let the world tell me they were both wrong. I will not let this be the end of their story." He stood up, the stoop in his shoulders a little less pronounced. "I am going to find out what really happened," he said, more to himself than to them. "I don't have a company anymore, but I still have a name. And I have enough left to fund one last investigation. The truth is down there in the dark, and I am going to bring it into the light. With the last of his personal fortune, Alistair hired a private salvage crew. Weeks later, the mangled wreckage of the main turbine was painstakingly raised from the ocean floor. It was a sad, twisted monument to failure. The official investigation had already concluded, its report a final nail in the coffin. It blamed unprecedented torsional stress on an unconventional blade design, citing a fundamental flaw that made the structure incapable of withstanding real-world deep-sea pressures. The wreckage was moved to a cavernous, private hangar at a small airfield, one of the last properties Alistair still owned. There, he, Clara, and a handful of engineers who had refused to abandon him began their own desperate search for answers. They pored over the broken metal, analyzed the stress reports, and reran the data from the final, fatal moments. But everything they found seemed to confirm the official report. The evidence was overwhelming. The design had failed. Hope began to wither. One afternoon, Maria brought Lily to the hangar. She was worried about the girl, hoping that seeing the engineers still working, still believing, might help rekindle some of her lost confidence. Lily wandered through the hangar, her hands in her pockets, looking at the giant, broken pieces of her dream. She felt a profound sadness, but she wasn't afraid of it. While Alistair and Clara argued over a complex data chart, Lily was drawn to a sound station set up in a corner. An engineer was replaying the audio logs recovered from the array's underwater microphones. It was the sound of the disaster. The deep, powerful hum of the turbines, then the rising, discordant whine, and finally, the horrific shriek of tearing metal. The engineer shook his head and shut it off. "Just noise," he muttered. "Tells us nothing." But Lily stood frozen, her head tilted. She had heard it. The wrongness. She walked over to the console and, with a tentative finger, touched the screen. "Can you play it again?" she asked. "Just the part before the crash." The engineer, surprised, obliged. He isolated the final 30 seconds of audio. The deep hum filled the hangar, a sound of immense power. Then, overlaying it, the high-pitched, insistent whine began. Lily closed her eyes, listening intently. She was not hearing data. She was hearing a story of a beautiful, strong sound being attacked by a smaller, meaner one. "That's it," she whispered. She opened her eyes and looked at Alistair, who had walked over to see what had captured her attention. It wasn't just angry, she told him, remembering the words she had used on the platform. It was singing the wrong song. She hummed the deep, steady note of the turbines. "That's the right song. The happy song." Then, she perfectly mimicked the high-pitched, penetrating whine. "This one," she said, pointing to the speaker. "This is a mean whisper. It came to hurt the other song. It doesn't belong." Alistair and Clara exchanged a look. A child's fanciful words. And yet, a mean whisper. A song that didn't belong. Clara, whose respect for Lily's intuition was absolute, turned back to the console. "A foreign frequency," she mused. She began to work, her fingers flying across the keyboard, isolating the high-pitched whine Lily had identified. She analyzed its precise acoustic signature. It was a clean, consistent frequency, not the chaotic noise of a system breaking down. It was a pure note. What if it wasn't the result of the failure? Clara said, her eyes widening. What if it was the cause? A new idea, a wild and improbable one, sparked in the air. She cross-referenced the frequency with a materials database, asking the computer a question no one else had thought to ask. Was there any material used in the array that had a specific structural vulnerability to this exact acoustic frequency? The answer came back in seconds. The computer flagged a single entry. A specific, slightly cheaper grade of titanium alloy, one sometimes used in pressure bolts. The report was clear. Prolonged exposure to that exact frequency would induce rapid acoustic fatigue, making the metal catastrophically brittle. "But that's not the alloy we used," one of the engineers protested. The manifest, the purchase orders, they all specified the grade 9 aerospace alloy. It's impervious to acoustic fatigue. Alistair's face went pale. He walked slowly to the wreckage of the main turbine axle. He knelt beside one of the sheared-off bolt heads, still embedded in the twisted metal. He ran his fingers over it. "Get a sample," he ordered, his voice grim. "Get a sample and test it." Now, an hour later, the results came back from the hangar's small lab. The metal from the bolt was not the grade 9 alloy from the manifest. It was the cheaper, vulnerable alloy, the one susceptible to the mean whisper. The truth landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't a design flaw. It wasn't a miscalculation. It wasn't Lily's fault. It was sabotage. Alistair Finch now knew who had done this. There was only one person with the knowledge, the motive, and the cold, precise hatred to conceive of such a beautifully cruel act of destruction. The confrontation did not happen in an office or a boardroom. Alistair arranged to meet Everett Sterling at a quiet, public park near a windswept bluff overlooking the ocean. Sterling arrived looking confident, successful. He had recently accepted a lucrative consulting position with a rival firm, his reputation secured as the man who had been right about the Finch folly. He looked at Alistair with a kind of pitying contempt. "Alistair," he said, his tone smooth, "to what do I owe the pleasure? I hope you're not here to ask for a loan." Alistair didn't answer. He simply placed a small digital recorder on the park bench between them. He pressed play. First, the sound of the turbine's deep hum filled the air. Then, the high-pitched, penetrating whine. And finally, the voice of a little girl, humming the second note perfectly. "This is a mean whisper," her recorded voice said. It came to hurt the other song. Sterling's smug expression flickered. His face tightened. "A child's ear is a remarkable thing, Everett," Alistair said, his voice as cold and calm as the deep sea. "She hears things we've trained ourselves to ignore. She heard your crime. She heard the song you used to make metal brittle. The song you used to try and destroy us." He slid a single sheet of paper across the bench. It was the metallurgical report on the bolts. Sterling glanced at it, and the last of the color drained from his face. His perfect crime, his intellectual masterpiece of revenge, had been unraveled by a little girl humming a tune. The absurdity, the indignity of it, was the final, crushing blow to his pride. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His face was a confession. Sterling was arrested the next day. The story of his sabotage was even more sensational than the story of the initial disaster. His fall was swift, total, and unlamented. 1 year later, there was no grand ceremony this time. No crowd of reporters or investors. Just a small group of people on a boat, floating on a calm, gray sea under a dawn sky. Alistair, Maria, Lily, Clara, and the small team that had kept the faith. Out on the water, a single green light began to blink, steady and strong. Deep beneath them, the Nereid array, rebuilt with the right materials and a deeper wisdom, was awake. It spun in the current, its dance now silent and flawless, a work of quiet, enduring strength. It was generating power, sending it to the shore, a clean and steady heartbeat. Alistair stood at the railing, watching the light. He had managed to secure new, more thoughtful investors. He hadn't rebuilt his entire empire, and he didn't want to. He had built the only thing that mattered. He had kept his promise. He turned to Lily, who was standing beside him, her sketchbook open on the railing. She was drawing again. Not just spirals, but new shapes, new ideas, new questions for the world. "Elena would have been so proud of you, Lily," he said softly. "Of both of you," he added, his eyes meeting Maria's in a look of shared gratitude and deep, quiet friendship. He had created a new foundation, funded by the first profits from the array. He called it the Elena and Lily Foundation for Listening. Its mission was simple: to support the kind of ideas that are born not from pride or ambition, but from a humble, patient observation of the world's quiet truths. The sun broke through the clouds, spreading a warm, golden light across the water. Lily looked up from her drawing, a small, peaceful smile on her face. The mean whisper was gone, replaced by the steady, happy song of the ocean, a song she had always been able to hear. And in her heart, she knew, and in the quiet triumph of the man beside her, the whole world could now see that the most powerful force on earth was not the strength of a wave, but the courage of a heart humble enough to listen to its dance. Thank you for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Stay tuned for more immersive stories.